In war, the word ace means you've downed 5 aircraft. A double ace means 10. But the ace of aces? That title belongs to one man, the greatest fighter pilot America ever produced. His name was Richard Bong. 40 confirmed victories. Pacific skies. A legend born from steel, fire, and the silence that followed. He flew a P-38 Lightning named Marge, after the woman he loved. Red-tipped wings, a painted face on the nose. Every mark on that fuselage told a story. 40 enemy flags. Each one witnessed, each one confirmed. But his record only tells half the truth. Because Bong's story isn't just about the planes he destroyed. It's about the man he refused to become. He was born in 1920 in a small Wisconsin town called Poplar. A farm boy, the eldest of 9. He grew up through the Great Depression, learning toughness not from war, but from frostbitten mornings and fields that didn't forgive mistakes. At 8 years old, fate found him. A U.S. Army mail plane flew low over the family farm, so low he could see the pilot wave. For weeks, it passed overhead, and in those brief moments, a boy from the cornfields discovered his calling. From that day forward, Richard Bong was obsessed. He read every aviation book he could find, built model airplanes, and dreamed of joining the ranks of the men who ruled the sky. His father, a World War I veteran, told him stories of Eddie Rickenbacker, the ace of aces from the last war. 26 kills. A hero carved into American legend. That night, Bong decided he'd become the next one. But destiny, as it often does, made him fight for it. The Great Depression closed schools, emptied towns, and buried dreams. To become a pilot, he needed college 2 years minimum at a time when many couldn't even afford a bus ticket. So Bong walked, worked, studied by lantern light. He graduated near the top of his class, then enrolled at Wisconsin Superior, the closest college with a flight program. And in 1938, the U.S. government passed the Civil Aeronautics Act, offering free pilot training to students. He was one of the first to apply, one of the first accepted. In the sky, Bong was different. Where others wrestled with the controls, he danced with them. Flying wasn't work, it was instinct. By 1941, he joined the U.S. Army Air Corps, and then Pearl Harbor. Everything changed. The dreamer from Wisconsin was about to step into a world where heroes were measured not in grades, but in kills. He trained others first, a gunnery instructor teaching men how to fight in planes he longed to fly. While his students went off to war, Bong stayed behind, waiting for his chance. Until one day, in 1942, fate came roaring down the runway. A P-38 Lightning landed for testing. Bong challenged the pilot to a mock dogfight, his old T-6 Texan trainer versus the most advanced fighter in the world. 15 mock kills later, the P-38 pilot landed, stunned. "That farm kid," he told command, "flies better than anyone I've ever seen." The next week, Richard Bong joined the fighter wing. The boy who once waved at airplanes would now hunt in one. The P-38 Lightning was unlike anything else in the sky. Twin engines, 400 miles per hour, 4 .50 caliber machine guns, and a 20mm cannon mounted in its nose. It was beautiful, deadly, and utterly American. Over the Pacific, the Japanese called it 2 planes, 1 pilot. The Germans called it the fork-tailed devil. To Bong, it was freedom, and his destiny. But before he ever fired a shot, he nearly lost it all. In 1942, during a training flight, Bong flew his P-38 under the Golden Gate Bridge, then down Market Street in San Francisco, 30 feet above the pavement. Laundry flew off clotheslines. People panicked, thinking they were under attack. He was summoned by General George Kenney, expecting court-martial. Instead, the general tore up the report and said, "Son, if you didn't want to do loops through that bridge, I wouldn't want you." He saw in Bong not recklessness, but something far rarer, a man fearless enough to lead. Months later, Bong followed Kenney into the Pacific. By 1943, the boy from Poplar was flying combat missions over New Guinea, 2 kills in his first engagement. By the next month, he was an ace, and with every sortie, his legend grew not just for his skill, but for his heart. He'd cripple an enemy fighter, then radio his wingman, finish him off. He wanted his men to feel victory. He was building warriors, not counting trophies, but legends have moments that define them. For Bong, it wasn't a dogfight. It was a rescue. A fellow pilot went down near a lake, and as the crew tried to reach him, Bong spotted movement in the water. A massive crocodile heading straight for the raft. He dove his P-38 and fired. 4 machine guns and a cannon roared. The crocodile never reached them. When he landed, the men laughed. "You gonna paint that one on your plane?" He did. A tiny crocodile beneath the 40 flags, proof that even the ace of aces had a sense of humor. By late 1943, Bong had become a symbol. A hero in the headlines, a mystery to his men. He gave away kills, risked his life for others, and when he could have gone home as America's top ace, he stayed. Not for fame, not for medals, but for them, for the men who followed him through clouds and fire. 1944. The Pacific sky burned every day. Dogfights above the jungle, smoke curling from wreckage that never reached the sea. By now, Richard Bong had become a legend, though he never acted like one. He led from the front, never from the radio. He joked with the crew, fixed his own guns, and when others bragged about kills, he'd smile softly and say, "Lucky shot." He wasn't chasing glory, he was protecting home. Each time his P-38 took off, he carried not ego but 9 siblings, a mother and a girl named Marge, waiting somewhere far away in Wisconsin. In combat, Bong was fearless, almost unnervingly calm. He'd close to point-blank range before firing, so close that his guns sometimes scorched enemy fuselages. When asked why, he said simply, "I'm not that great a shot. I just fly close enough not to miss." It wasn't bravado, it was humility and maybe something deeper. He knew every bullet meant another son, another brother, another young man would never go home. War had made him lethal, but it hadn't made him cruel. By mid-1944, Bong was a double ace, then a triple. His commander, General George Kenney, watched him climb the scoreboard, but also noticed the pattern. Bong gave away 1 out of every 3 confirmed kills to his men. He didn't need numbers to prove who he was. He cared about building confidence in others. When Kenney offered to send him home after 20 victories, Bong smiled and said, "Then I'll hit 20, just in time for deer season." That was the Wisconsin farm boy talking. Even in war, he never left the earth behind. He returned home briefly, greeted like a movie star. Newspapers called him America's ace of aces. Parades, interviews, radio broadcasts. Everyone wanted to know the secret. How did one man shoot down 40 planes? Bong's answer was always the same. "I don't know. I just get close, pull the trigger, and pray." At a university homecoming that fall, he met her again, Marjorie Vattendahl, the girl whose name was already painted on his plane. She was the homecoming queen. He was the returning hero. And for once, both fame and fate agreed. They fell in love instantly. When his leave ended, he told her, "I want to marry you, but not before I come home alive." She promised to wait. He left her a photograph, the same one that would later be painted on the nose of his new P-38 Marge, beneath 40 tiny flags and a single red heart. Every mission after that carried her name. Back in the Pacific, Bong and his mentor, Tom Lynch, formed a duo the press called the Flying Circus. Two of America's deadliest pilots, free to choose their own missions. Their presence alone lifted morale wherever they flew. But war never spares its heroes for long. In March 1944, during a low-altitude attack on Japanese ships, Tom Lynch's plane was hit. It exploded before it could pull up. Bong circled the smoke for minutes, refusing to leave. He would later write, "He taught me how to fight and how not to die afraid." From that day, something in him changed. He stopped chasing danger, but he never stopped flying toward it. General Kenny, seeing his grief, gave him leave disguised as an assignment. Bong returned to Australia, waited, and healed. When he came back to base, his plane Marge was gone, borrowed and crashed by another pilot. Years later, the wreckage would be found deep in the jungle, still carrying the red paint that once bore Marge's face. At the time, Bong didn't complain. He only said, "As long as the pilot made it, it's just metal." Soon after, he broke Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 kills. Reporters called. Generals congratulated. Eddie himself sent a case of scotch. Kenny sans champagne. MacArthur sent a lecture about discipline and humility. Bong just laughed. To him, fame felt like a uniform that never fit. But behind the headlines was exhaustion. He'd survived too many close calls, lost too many friends, and now he was more symbol than soldier. Kenny grounded him. "For your own good," he said, and ordered him home. This time, Bong didn't argue. He'd seen enough of the sky. Back in the States, Bong became a reluctant celebrity. Interviews, war bond tours, cameras flashing. He smiled politely but hated every second. When a reporter asked why the army would pull its best pilot out of combat, Bong replied, "So I don't die." It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was the truth. He married Marge in February 1945. For once, life seemed still. Then came his final assignment, test pilot for Lockheed's first jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star. It was the future of aviation. Sleek, fast, dangerous. Bong treated it like every other machine he'd ever trusted, with respect and curiosity, never fear. On the 6th of August 1945, he took the P-80 up for its 12th test flight. Above Los Angeles, witnesses saw black smoke trailing from the engine. He could have ejected. He didn't. Beneath him were houses, schools, people. He stayed in the cockpit, guiding the jet away until he found a clear field. By the time he could bail out safely, it was too late. The jet hit the ground and exploded. It was the same day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. The next morning's newspaper carried two headlines side by side. Atomic bomb hits Japan. Major Richard Bong killed in jet crash. He was 24. 40 confirmed kills. 1,000 lives saved. And a love that outlived the war. His wife, Marge, received the Medal of Honor he'd earned months earlier. General Kenny placed it in her hands, his voice breaking. He called Bong the finest pilot I ever knew and the humblest man I ever met. She wept quietly and said nothing. Back in Poplar, Wisconsin, the farm boys' town built a museum. His P-38 replica stands there, still red nose cones, Marge's portrait, and 40 flags below the cockpit. Visitors often stop at the photo beside it, a young man with kind eyes, smiling as if he never learned how to frown. Richard Bong never flew again, but his name became legend. Not because he killed more enemies than anyone else, but because he proved that greatness can live quietly, that you can fight with courage and still walk with humility, that sometimes the truest heroes aren't the loudest. They're the ones who come home, hang up their wings, and keep their promises. He was the ace of aces, but to the people who knew him, he was still just Dick from Poplar, the farm kid who looked up one summer morning, saw a pilot wave from the sky, and decided to spend the rest of his life returning that wave. After Bong's death, the war ended within weeks. The headlines faded, the pilots came home, and the skies over the Pacific grew silent again. But in hangars and homes across America, his name stayed alive, whispered among young pilots who dreamed of flying like him. They called him the ace of aces. But those who'd fought beside him knew better. He wasn't chasing titles. He was chasing perfection, not for himself, but for the men who followed him into the clouds. General George Kenney would later say, if courage had a face, it would have looked like Dick Bong's. He'd seen men break under fire, seen the fear that war plants inside every human being. But Bong never showed it. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he refused to let others see it. That was his kind of leadership, silent, steady, unwavering. When others talked about fear, he talked about home. When others counted kills, he counted the ones who made it back. There's a photo, black and white, grainy, taken just weeks before his final flight. He's standing beside his P-38 Marge, hands in pockets, that easy smile on his face. The paint on the nose is chipped, the metal skin scarred by war. Behind him, the Pacific sky looks endless. You can almost feel the wind he once rode, the freedom he once owned. It's hard to imagine that within a year, both the war and the man would be gone. But the story didn't end there. For decades, his name inspired generations of flyers, men and women who understood what he represented. Skill without arrogance, strength without cruelty, duty without ego. At the Bong Veterans Historical Center in Wisconsin, school children still walk through the exhibits, staring up at the replica of his P-38. And sometimes, if you stand there long enough, you'll see their reflections in the polished aluminum. Eyes wide, hearts awake, like a boy watching a plane wave across a farm sky in 1928. Marge never remarried. For the rest of her life, she kept his photo on her desk, the one he gave her before he left for war. She lived quietly, out of the spotlight, and when she passed away in 2003, the people of Poplar buried her just a few miles from where Richard was born. Two lives, one love reunited by time. On her tombstone, beneath her name, there's a single line, "Forever his Marge." Some say Bong's story is about flying. Others say it's about heroism. But maybe it's about something simpler, the kind of man who could win a war and still stay human. He never boasted, never demanded, never forgot where he came from. In a time of chaos, he was calm. In a time of death, he chose life for others again and again. And maybe that's why his legend endures. Because in every cockpit, in every sky, in every young pilot who feels fear for the first time, there's a whisper of the ace of aces, the farm boy from Wisconsin who proved that true greatness doesn't need noise. It just needs heart. When the wind crosses the fields of Poplar at sunset, it carries a sound faint, distant, like a twin-engine hum fading into the horizon. If you listen closely, you might imagine him there. Still flying, still smiling, still waving back.